Hey friends, welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a quiet, forgotten corner of history. A 6-year-old girl, crowned Queen of England. Not someday, right then. They placed a velvet crown on her head, put her on a ship, and sent her across the sea to marry a king 3 times her age. This was not fiction. This was medieval England. Her name was Isabella of Valois, and though most have forgotten her, she watched 2 kingdoms collapse. And somehow, she survived. If you enjoy soft, strange, and true stories like this, feel free to subscribe. It helps more than you think. And while you are here, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Settle in. Let the days slip away. And let me tell you the story of a child queen who outlived an empire. This is boring history for sleep. And this is the story of Isabella of Valois. Long before the wind ever touched the white cliffs of Dover that season, before the ship bearing her sailed into English waters, a child in silk and sorrow stood at the edge of history, unaware that she would be remembered more for surviving kingdoms than ruling them. She was 6 years old. Her name was Isabella of Valois, and in the quiet hours before dawn, her eyes were already too old for her face. The French court had done what all courts did. It polished her. It wrapped her in silk and sweet words and called it preparation. But no gown, no tutor, no garden wall could ready a child for what it meant to become queen of a land that would never truly be hers. The seas that separated France and England had swallowed many men's fates before hers, and now they would try to swallow hers too. The marriage was spoken of as peace, a treaty to quiet the long, bitter 100 Years' War. But peace was never the concern of those holding the pens. It was simply a quieter form of war, and Isabella, with her pearl-stitched veil and fragile composure, was its offering. She was to marry King Richard II of England. He was 29. She was 6. In the candlelit halls of Paris, her mother wept behind tapestries, while courtiers whispered of alliances and dowries. Her father, King Charles VI of France, vacillated between lucid clarity and cruel madness. When he was sane, he told her she would bring peace between 2 kingdoms. When he was not, he forgot who she was. Sometimes he screamed at the walls. Sometimes he refused to recognize her face. The journey to England began beneath banners of gold and azure, amid a grand procession that meant to soothe the conscience of history. Isabella was not told what marriage would mean. She was only told to smile when the trumpets sounded and not to cry when the priests began to chant. Her little hands were cold inside her gloves, though it was not the season that made them so. When she first saw the shores of England, cold and wind-bitten, so unlike the green softness of the Seine, she said nothing. She simply gripped the rail of the ship, her knuckles white, and listened to the seagulls cry like lost children in the mist. Richard II awaited her with ceremony and charm. He was graceful, elegant, a man of cultivated manner and careful speech. He bent before her, a gesture meant to reassure the nervous nobles and foreign watchers, and told her she was more beautiful than spring. She looked up at him, unsure whether to curtsy or run. She did neither. The wedding was held in the Great Hall of Westminster. She wore white satin, embroidered with lilies and fleurs-de-lis, and a crown so heavy that her neck trembled beneath it. Richard placed a jeweled ring on her finger. She did not understand the words spoken over her head, nor the meaning behind the sealed treaty. She understood only that when the bells rang, the faces around her brightened with relief, as if a problem had been solved by wrapping a child in silk and pretending it was love. The English court received her with a politeness so practiced it felt like performance. Her French accent was soft, her manner obedient. But her eyes watched everything. She did not laugh when the other children laughed, nor did she cry when she was left alone in the stone corridors. She had already learned what it meant to observe without being seen. Lady Maud, one of her English governesses, remarked that the child spoke like an old soul. "She is quiet," said another, "but she listens as though she remembers." They spoke around her, forgetting she understood more than she let on. And so Isabella absorbed courtly English, not from tutors alone, but from watching lips move and silences stretch. In the gardens behind the palace, she was sometimes permitted to walk, guarded, always. It was there she first met Margaret Holland, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was 8. She smelled of violets and wore ribbons in her hair. She did not ask Isabella to play. Instead, she sat beside her in the grass and asked if she missed home. Isabella nodded. She did not cry. Margaret nodded too. And that was the beginning of something rare at court, friendship not born of ambition. The days passed slowly, marked by lessons and ceremonies, embroidery hoops and careful walks. At night, she lay in a gilded bed far too large for her small frame, staring up at carved wooden beams. Sometimes she imagined she was back in her mother's arms. Sometimes she tried to remember her father's voice on the good days. But mostly, she tried to sleep with her hands folded properly, because a queen must never look disheveled, even in dreams. Richard visited often at first. He brought her dolls carved from ivory, picture books of saints and kings. He called her his little piece. He never touched her in ways that frightened her. He did not try to be a husband. He tried to be something like a father. And she, in her child's heart, did not yet know the difference. He would kneel beside her and ask about her French lessons. She would show him her needlework. He smiled when she embroidered a rose instead of a lily. "A Queen of England already," he said. She smiled back, not knowing what it cost him to keep the war at bay. Isabella grew taller in her silks. Her English became stronger. But her crown never seemed to fit. It pinched behind the ears and slid to one side if she tilted her head. Lady Maud once tried to pad it with velvet. "You will grow into it," she whispered. Isabella nodded, though some part of her doubted that. At court, she was spoken of with increasing fondness. "The little queen is charming," said the nobles. "So well behaved, so clever for her age." And so she was praised, not for her thoughts, but for her silence. In her chambers, tapestries told stories of battles she could not name. Her tutors taught her to read not just English, but the expressions of courtiers and the pauses in council meetings. She learned where to stand during ceremonies, when to bow her head, and how to speak without saying anything. And yet, through it all, she remained a child. A child whose dolls watched from shelves as history moved around her. A child whose footsteps echoed in empty corridors too vast for comfort. A child wearing a crown made for a woman, standing still so the grown world might not crumble. Sometimes, at twilight, she would press her face to the cold glass of the window and watch the river glimmer beneath the setting sun. The bells of the abbey would toll in the distance. She would not speak, but her breath would fog the glass. And in that misted silence, she wondered if her mother missed her. By the end of her first year in England, Isabella could name most of the noble families. She could trace the line of Plantagenets through tapestry and scroll. She could recite the names of saints and kings with careful pronunciation. But she still dreamed of roses blooming outside the palace at Saint-Germain, and of the smell of her nurse's perfume. She was no longer the frightened child who had stepped off the ship. But neither was she the queen they pretended she would become. She was something else entirely, a girl caught in the silence between two swords, learning to stand still while others chose her fate. And as the winter of 1397 settled over London with its grey skies and breath-fogged windows, Isabella wrapped herself in velvet and waited. Waited for Richard to visit again. Waited for letters from France. Waited for her crown to stop slipping sideways. She did not know it yet, but the years ahead would demand everything from her: her patience, her dignity, her silence, and later, her strength. But for now, she simply breathed, and watched, and waited. As all child queens must. Winter eventually gave way to a reluctant spring. The grey canopy above London loosened its hold, and the river ran freer and wider. But within the stone walls of the royal household, things did not warm. Not really. The court of King Richard II, which once glittered with ceremony and poetic grandeur, had begun to thin. Not in fabric or feast, but in spirit. Something was changing. Isabella, now 7, did not have the words for it. But she could feel it in the way voices grew quieter in the corridors. in the way some nobles no longer bowed as deeply, and in the way her husband, Richard, visited her less and less. When he did come, he was different. His hands fidgeted, his gaze wandered, and his sentences drifted off halfway through. He would kiss her forehead, softly, gently, and ask if she was practicing her Latin or sleeping well. But then he would go quiet, and simply sit beside her, lost in thought. Once, she reached out and took his hand. It was cold. Not with winter's chill, but with something deeper, something that no fire could warm. "I am tired," he said to her once softly. She thought he meant from travel. But he meant from betrayal. The court, as she learned through whispers and glances, was no longer a place of loyalty. It was becoming something else. Something dangerous. Richard's old allies had begun to vanish. Some fled. Some were imprisoned. Some had simply stopped smiling. The nobles around her were polite, but restless. They stood straighter, spoke quicker, and always seemed to be watching one another. Her attendants noticed too. Lady Maud, once so calm, began triple-checking the locks on Isabella's doors. Meals were tasted twice. Messages were filtered. No letters from France arrived for weeks at a time. And yet, on the surface, nothing was said aloud. Banquets still happened. Processions were still held. And Richard, ever the performer, still wore the crown as if it were not sinking under the weight of discontent. But Isabella could see it in his eyes. Even at her young age, she could sense the cracks forming. She did not fully understand what a rebellion was. But she learned that when kings began to worry, even their child queens were moved like chess pieces. It began one evening when Margaret Holland arrived breathless at her chambers. "We are leaving," she said. "Now." "To where?" Isabella asked. "Westminster tonight." "Then the Tower." Isabella's heart began to race. She had heard of the Tower. A fortress. A palace. A prison. She did not know which version she would find. Their departure from the palace was nothing like a royal procession. There were no cheering crowds. No trumpets. No ribbons or flowers. Just darkness, and guards, a row of armored figures mounted on horses that flanked her litter. The curtains were drawn tight. But outside she heard the sounds of London in a different voice than she had ever known. No bells. No marketplaces. Just shouts. And the occasional sharp, sudden clash of metal. The Tower was cold, even in spring. Not in temperature but in tone. Her rooms were well appointed, but the windows were barred. Guards stood at the corners, unsmiling. Her English attendants were dismissed without ceremony. Only her French ladies were allowed to remain. It felt less like a home, and more like a gilded cage. It was here, on the second day, that Richard visited again. And it was here she saw how much he had changed. His once gleaming robes were now creased and hastily fastened. His hair was unkempt, his face pale. He knelt before her chair just as he had the day they first met, but this time, there was no joy in the gesture. "My dear child," he said, voice trembling, "our kingdom is unsettled." Isabella, now older and sharper, met his eyes directly. "Are you still king?" she asked. The question silenced the room. Richard's smile was faint. "For now," he replied. "But there are many who wish it otherwise." He spoke to her that day not as a child but as a young queen who deserved to understand her world. He explained, in guarded but clear terms, that Henry Bolingbroke had returned. That some of the great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause. That her safety, and even her title, were no longer secure. She asked only one thing. "What will happen to me?" "I do not know," he said. And it was the truest thing he had ever told her. In the days that followed, Isabella began to understand what it meant to live in a palace that was also a prison. Rumors swirled among her French ladies. Whispered names, battles in the north, shifting loyalties. The world outside was turning. And no guard on any tower could stop it. Then, on a gray morning, came the knock she had been dreading. New men entered her chambers. They wore unfamiliar colors, red roses, and spoke with a different authority. One of them was tall, with a soldier's frame and cold eyes that scanned everything before settling on her. This, she was told, was Henry Bolingbroke. No longer a rebel. Now, King Henry the Fourth. He addressed her as Your Grace, and though he used the correct formality, Isabella felt the shift. She was no longer the child bride of a reigning king. She was now a political complication. He told her, gently but firmly, that Richard had abdicated. That he, Henry, now ruled England. That her future depended on many factors. Her father's reaction, the advice of Henry's own council, and, most curiously, Isabella's own conduct. She did not answer right away. She merely nodded. Then she turned toward the barred window and looked out at the Thames, its grey water coiling below. Somewhere far beyond that river, the bells of Westminster rang. But not for her. The days turned into weeks. She remained in the Tower, not formally a prisoner, but not free either. Some in Henry's circle argued she should be sent back to France, a gesture that would save England the expense of maintaining her. Others believed she was still too useful to discard. Her presence gave them leverage. Isabella said nothing publicly, but in private she listened carefully. Her French ladies coached her well. They reminded her that her marriage had not yet been annulled, that in the eyes of France she remained queen, that there was still hope, as long as she held her dignity. And so, she played the role. Polite, quiet, watchful. She walked the fine line between being docile and being proud. She bowed when she must. She did not complain. But she never let them forget, not with her posture, not with her gaze, that she was not merely a child, but a queen in waiting. Then came the news she had been fearing. Richard was dead. The whisper passed like smoke through the corridors. Some said he died of sorrow. Others said it was no accident. Isabella did not know the truth. But when the final confirmation came, she locked herself in her chamber and said nothing for a full day. She had not loved him as a wife loves a husband. She had not even fully known him. But he had been kind. He had shielded her. And he had been, in many ways, the only family she had known since crossing the sea. His death severed something in her. Not love. Not marriage. But safety. Shortly after, Henry's court delivered an ultimatum. She could return to France, but only if she acknowledged Henry as rightful king, and renounced all claims to the throne as Richard's widow. It was a clean solution for Henry. A tidy political exit. For Isabella, it was something else entirely. A demand that she erase the last 3 years of her life. Her French advisers were divided. Some urged her to accept, to return home and begin anew. Others insisted she must refuse, that accepting Henry's terms would betray Richard's memory and weaken France's leverage. For weeks she said nothing, and then word came from Paris. Her father, King Charles VI, in a moment of clarity, demanded her return. The message was clear. If negotiations continued, France would consider it an act of hostility. There was no choice now. She would go. The return journey across the Channel was quieter than the one that had brought her to England. No banners. No parades. Just grey sails and grey skies. As the English coast receded behind her, Isabella stood on the deck, her veil wrapped tight against the wind, and whispered a single word into the sea. Goodbye. The crossing from Dover to Calais was calm, but Isabella did not notice. The waves rocked her gently, the sea breeze lifted the edges of her cloak, and the sun rose behind a veil of morning mist. But none of these things brought her comfort. She stood still beneath the sails, staring eastward toward a homeland that no longer felt like home. The salt on her lips tasted the same as it had years before, but now it mixed with a quiet grief that sat low in her chest. She was not a child anymore. Not quite a woman either. She was something else. Something between. Her attendants spoke in French again, full of nervous excitement at the prospect of returning to court. But Isabella now found herself needing to pause, just slightly, before replying in her native tongue. Her accent had shifted. Her rhythm. Her voice had taken on a tone more English than French, softened by years among a different people. It was the first sign that she was no longer entirely of one world. When she arrived in Paris, she expected an embrace, a rush of familiarity. But the streets she passed through looked smaller now, the faces older, the voices quicker and more clipped than she remembered. The palace gates did not open in welcome, they creaked with the weariness of routine. She was led not to her childhood rooms, but to a guest wing near the eastern garden, as if she were a visitor. And in truth she was. Her father, King Charles VI, was in no condition to receive her. The court murmured about his episodes, but Isabella soon saw the reality for herself. When they first brought her to him, he did not recognize her. His eyes darted through her face as if searching for something long lost. He mumbled about betrayal, about blood on the walls, about enemies in his chambers. He waved her away with the same frightened gesture he gave to invisible shadows. It was her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, who greeted her properly, if coolly. The Queen of France was beautiful still, her posture upright, her eyes sharp. She kissed Isabella's cheek and immediately began asking questions about Richard's court, the layout of Westminster, the temperaments of England's nobles. Isabella answered cautiously. She knew enough to understand that she was no longer simply a daughter. She was a vessel of knowledge, valuable, fragile, and deeply watched. In the weeks that followed, Isabella's return became a quiet kind of puzzle for the court to solve. She was treated with respect, of course. She had been a queen, after all. But that fact also made her inconvenient. Too grand for some circles, too foreign for others. She belonged everywhere and nowhere. The old friends she remembered from childhood had grown into strangers. They whispered when she passed. Some curtsied too deeply. Others not at all. Her accent, her clothing, her mannerisms, all faintly English now, marked her as different. She felt it most sharply in the mornings, when she reached for her slippers and instinctively turned toward where her English ladies used to kneel, waiting to dress her. Now there were new faces. French faces. But unfamiliar hands. Her mother, though attentive, remained guarded. Isabeau had learned to navigate a court of chaos, where her husband's madness left power scattered like broken glass across noble families. She was playing a long game, and Isabella, whether she wished it or not, was now part of the board. Whispers began about marriage again. Suitors. Alliances. Possibilities. She heard the names, a German prince, a Milanese cousin, even a Burgundian nephew. All powerful. All strategic. But none felt real. Isabella said little, choosing instead to retreat into study. She began spending hours in the palace library, rereading the poetry she had once read with Richard. She wrote letters, many of them unfinished, trying to untangle her thoughts. And she walked the gardens alone, letting the wind wrap around her as it once had in England. She missed Margaret Holland. She missed the rhythm of English verse. She missed the smell of damp stone halls and the warmth of Richard's quiet presence. It was during one of those walks that she overheard her name. Two noblewomen, distant cousins, were seated beneath the linden trees. They did not see her. Such a shame, one said. To have been queen and then returned with nothing. She carries herself still like a sovereign, said the other. Perhaps she forgets she is merely a widow now. The words struck her not with cruelty, but with clarity. Yes, she was a widow. At 11. But she was not nothing. She was not an empty gown left behind by history. She was still herself. That night, she stood before the mirror and unbraided her hair. Each loosened strand reminded her of a year past. A lesson learned. A betrayal survived. She was changing. Not into a queen. Not into a pawn. But into something deeper. Someone watching. Someone choosing. She began to write again, not letters, but reflections. In quiet corners of her chamber, by the light of a single candle, she recorded her memories of England. Not to share. Not yet. But to preserve. She remembered the smell of parchment. The taste of spiced wine. the weight of her crown the day it had been placed, too large, on her head. And the sound of Richard's voice when he had said, "You are not a child. You are a light." In France, that light had dimmed, but not extinguished. Then came the news from England. Henry IV, the usurper, was struggling. The Percy family had rebelled. Wales was rising under a mysterious figure named Owain. Scotland stirred restlessly. Her mother's council whispered again. "Perhaps," they said, "Isabella could be useful." The idea chilled her. The thought that war, real war, might be waged in her name, just to reclaim a peace long dead. She imagined the English countryside burning. The peasants she had known, the baker's daughter who once gave her honey cakes, caught in crossfire. When asked for her opinion, Isabella's answer was gentle. She spoke of sorrow, of the cost of war, of the thin line between justice and revenge. Some accused her of disloyalty, but others, quieter, older voices, nodded in respect. They saw in her not a girl queen, not a widow, but something rarer, a conscience. In the evenings she prayed for England, not for Henry, not for kings, but for the children who might lose parents, for the fields that might turn to ash, for the quiet souls who, like her, wanted only to live without fear. And she waited. For what, she did not know. But somewhere inside her, a new seed was taking root, not of anger, nor ambition, but of purpose. She had returned to France a stranger, but she would not remain one. The turning point in Isabella's life did not come with trumpets, or processions, or grand royal announcements. It began with a letter. A quiet, folded parchment delivered in the early mist of spring. Its edges were sealed with wax, the impression pressed deep, a family crest she recognized, though she had not seen it in years. It came from the Duke of Orleans, her cousin, her childhood acquaintance. And now, a man positioned at the center of France's most delicate ambitions. She read the letter slowly, as the candle flickered beside her. Charles, for he signed his name simply, had written not as a politician, but as a man aware of history's weight. He spoke of her dignity, of her years in England, of her quiet grace in the face of loss. And then, gently, came the proposal. Would she consider a union with him? Isabella's fingers paused on the parchment. The room felt still. Not tense, not electric, just very still. She did not know what to feel. She was nearly 14. Young, yes, but no longer sheltered. She understood what a marriage meant, the cost of it, the negotiations behind it, the expectations it carried like baggage through corridors and courts. She also understood what it did not guarantee. Safety, kindness, love. Her mother, Isabel, received the news with the cool calculation of a queen. A marriage within the royal family would secure Isabella's position, keep her from being used by foreign kings, place her under the protection of one of France's most powerful houses. "You will not find a more suitable match," she said firmly. "And he is cultured. He will not treat you unkindly." But Isabella had heard those words before. She had been told Richard was kind. And in truth he had been. But kindness had not saved him. Nor had it saved her from the long years of uncertainty and imprisonment that followed. What mattered now was not only kindness, but strength, mutual respect, and perhaps, though she did not say it aloud, something like understanding. When she met Charles again, this time no longer as a girl and boy underfoot at court, but as young royals negotiating the future, she was surprised. He had grown broader in the shoulders, yes, and his hair had darkened. But it was his voice that struck her most. Thoughtful, warm. When he spoke, he looked at her, not around her, not through her, but at her, with interest, with memory. "I remember you playing the harp once," he said with a smile. "You wore a ribbon of dark green." She had forgotten that day. But he had not. Their conversations were quiet, almost ordinary, and for that very reason, deeply precious. They spoke of poetry, of the frustrations of court, of the smell of autumn rain on stone walls. Isabella found herself responding in a way she had not expected, not with politeness, but with ease. With trust. Charles spoke no grand promises. He did not speak of kingdoms or alliances. Instead, he said, "If you choose me, I will not claim your history. I will simply walk beside it." Those words settled in her like warm cloth. For all her young life, Isabella had been passed from throne to treaty, from bedchamber to bargaining chip. But here, perhaps, was someone who saw her, not as a former queen, or as France's diplomatic pawn, but as Isabella. A girl growing into a woman. A survivor. A thinker. A heart. She took her time, but in the end, she accepted. The court celebrated with cautious joy. This marriage would not just solidify alliances, it would keep her close, in French hands, under French eyes. The date was set for the summer of 1406, and plans were made for a ceremony far more splendid than her wedding to Richard had been. This one would be public. Lavish. Joyful. Isabella approached it with quiet preparation. She had learned from the English court how quickly splendor could turn to sorrow. She instructed that her gown be simple in cut, though rich in color, deep blue, embroidered with gold and lilies. Her crown would be a modest circlet, not a towering headdress. She wanted to walk, not float. The day came with soft skies. Paris stirred with bells. In the great cathedral of Notre Dame, the choir's voices rose like mist from the stones. Isabella stepped into the nave not as a princess being offered, but as a woman walking forward. Charles stood at the altar, his hands clasped, his eyes on her alone. The vows were spoken clearly. There was no hesitation. And when he took her hand, it was not a claim. It was a question she answered, yes. That night, as the city celebrated, Isabella sat at the window of their new quarters, watching the torchlight shimmer on the Seine. Behind her, laughter echoed from the feast. Musicians played. Wine flowed. But she needed quiet. The stars were coming out, one by one. She leaned her head against the cool stone and let herself feel something close to peace. Marriage, she knew, was never simple. But this beginning, this choice, felt different. She had not been traded. She had not been forced. She had walked into this new life with her own 2 feet, wearing her own name. In the weeks that followed, she began to know Charles more intimately. He was a man of letters, a patron of poets, a curious soul. He listened when she spoke. He quoted her. He laughed not just at her jokes, but at her insights. He encouraged her to reclaim her voice, to write, to commission manuscripts, to begin her own scriptorium. She selected monks with care, requested volumes in both Latin and Middle French. She insisted that some be copied in English, too, for she had not forgotten that part of herself. At court, she was no longer just watched. She was heard. And though she still tread carefully, never overtly challenging her mother's positions or involving herself in factional disputes, her presence grew quietly formidable. When the court whispered now, it was not with pity, but with curiosity. What would Isabella do next? And for the first time in years, Isabella herself began to ask the same question, not in fear, not in dread, but with wonder. What could she do? She was still young, still learning. But she was no longer a child. No longer a widow. She was a woman of the French court. A duchess. A queen in her own right, if not by crown, then by bearing. And she was just beginning. The early months of Isabella's second marriage unfolded like the first hours of a warm spring. Everything seemed to breathe softer. Her feet no longer echoed alone through unfamiliar corridors. Her days, once filled with careful silences and measured responses, were now steeped in conversation, music, and books shared across candlelit tables. The halls of the Orleans residence echoed not with political edicts, but with gentle argument over verse and laughter between companions. Charles, her husband, proved to be everything he had promised in those first cautious letters. He was not only a statesman but an artist at heart, curious about history, captivated by language, and gentle in his governance of their domestic world. He shared not only his lands and titles with Isabella, but his thoughts, his questions, his fears. and she, in turn, shared hers. Their household became known across France as one of quiet brilliance. Scholars were welcomed at their court in Blois. Troubadours brought tales of distant lands and recited verses beneath ivy-covered arches. Illuminators, seated beneath leaded windows, copied manuscripts by day and debated theology by firelight at night. Isabella presided over it all with a calm and thoughtful grace. She was no longer a girl seated at the edge of a banquet table, uncertain of her role. She was now a woman in full presence, hosting, organizing, curating. She managed the household accounts with methodical care. She oversaw the education of her staff and even intervened when disputes arose between tenants on her husband's lands. Every decision was made with quiet purpose. In the spring of 1407, Isabella gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Jean. The birth changed everything and yet nothing, for even as her daily rhythms adjusted to accommodate motherhood, her heart had already been moving in that direction for some time. Holding Jean in her arms, she felt a tenderness more profound than she had known, and yet strangely familiar, as if this child were not only her daughter but her answer. She chose to nurse the infant herself, despite quiet protests from courtiers who murmured about royal dignity and tradition. "Let them whisper," she told Charles one night as he stood over her, watching their daughter sleep. "Let them say I am immodest. I would rather be present." Charles agreed. And when he saw his wife hunched in the window seat at dawn, cradling the child against her shoulder and softly singing in both French and English, his heart swelled with a love that words could not shape. But beyond the walls of their estate, shadows were gathering. News from England trickled in slowly, like water through old stone. Henry IV still ruled, but unrest stirred beneath the surface. The Percys had rebelled. The Welsh rose in arms. There were whispers of uprisings in Scotland and mutterings among discontented lords. Isabella listened, not with ambition, but with unease. She did not wish to return to that country. She did not dream of restoring her lost title. But she feared what instability there might mean, for others, for children, for the peace she had helped build in her early innocence. And in France, too, unease grew. The king, Charles VI, Isabella's father, wandered deeper into the labyrinth of his own mind. His episodes of clarity were shorter now, less frequent. His hallucinations more troubling. At times, he mistook his courtiers for enemies. At others, he refused food, claiming it was poisoned. He no longer recognized some of his children. And when Isabella visited, he would sometimes blink at her, smiling faintly, but with no name upon his lips. Her mother, Queen Isabel, continued to manage the court with ruthless pragmatism. But the power vacuum left by the king's illness had become a battleground. Two great houses began to circle each other like wolves, the Orleans and the Burgundians. Charles's father, Isabella's uncle, was now the de facto voice of royal authority. But the Duke of Burgundy, cousin to the king, had begun to challenge that control. He gathered support from other nobles. He whispered about wasteful spending, about corruption, about foreign influences at court. And all the while, Isabella tried to remain above it. She focused on her duties at Blois. She oversaw repairs to churches damaged by years of neglect. She began organizing a hospital for the poor, funded not by royal coffers, but by contributions from artists and poets she had once hosted. She wrote letters to her sister Valentina in Milan, and to English noblewomen she had once known, small connections to a wider world. But neutrality is a fragile thing in politics. It does not shelter you from storms, it only delays their arrival. In late autumn, news arrived like thunder. The Duke of Orleans, Charles's father, had been assassinated in Paris. Slain in broad daylight by men in the pay of the Duke of Burgundy. It had been swift, brutal, and intentional. Isabella stood silent for a long time when the message was read aloud to her. Jean was asleep in her arms. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The next day, the household changed. Bodyguards were stationed at every entrance. Staff were vetted, guests turned away. Letters were written, sealed, dispatched. And Charles, the man who had once held her hand during music recitals, who had once tucked flowers behind her ear as they walked the gardens, became harder, sharper. Grief changed him. But more than grief, responsibility. He was now the new Duke of Orleans, head of his house, heir to a blood feud that would define the next era of French history. And Isabella, his wife, felt the tremble beneath the world she had so carefully built. Even so, she did not retreat. She stepped into the role beside him, not as decoration, but as counsel. She helped manage their holdings. She mediated disputes among their tenants. She reviewed alliances and helped him choose words for critical letters. Her knowledge of England proved useful now more than ever, for England, too, teetered on instability, and what happened across the Channel might yet spill into their own war. One winter morning, she sat with Charles in the study. Snow feathered the windows. Jean played with wooden toys on a fur rug by the hearth. "What are we becoming?" he asked quietly. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "We are what we must be," she replied. "Until the day we can be what we choose to be." They did not speak of love that night, but they held hands long after the candles had burned low. Snow still lay across the rooftops of Blois like a hush over the world. The cold had stiffened the trees, blanketed the streets, and made the castle stones creak at night with the groans of old timber under frost. In the quiet after the murder of her father-in-law, Isabella found herself walking the halls alone more often, not because Charles had withdrawn from her, but because his world had changed. And with it, so had hers. The grief had been public and profound. Bells had tolled from Paris to Chartres in mourning for the Duke of Orleans. Couriers came and went bearing condolences and threats alike. The court, once a place of art and wit, now buzzed with names of allies and enemies, of potential betrayals and secret plots. And Isabella, now Duchess in truth as well as in title, found herself no longer a host of salons and poetic gatherings, but a steadying figure in the midst of quiet, rising war. Yet the strangest thing about those winter months was how ordinary they still seemed, on the surface. Isabella woke each morning to the cooing of her daughter Jean. She oversaw the kitchens. She reviewed the accounts. And she greeted Charles not as a general or grieving son, but as her husband, the same man who smiled when Jean crawled across the floor, the same man who once composed verses for her by firelight. But under that peace, the fracture lines deepened. The murder of Louis of Orleans had been no accident, no crime of passion. It had been orchestrated with precision by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. He had not only arranged the killing, he had boasted of it, claimed it as an act of justice, claimed that Louis had been a danger to France, claimed that by removing him, he had saved the kingdom from ruin. This was not just murder. It was a challenge. Charles of Orleans, Isabella's husband, could not ignore it. And neither could Isabella. They did not speak often of revenge, but it hovered in the air between them, like the smoke curling from the chimney tops, always rising, never quite dissipating. Charles summoned allies. He called on family and friends. He began quietly assembling forces, readying for the conflict he knew must come. And Isabella prepared, too, in her own way. She met with her stewards, re-evaluating supplies, food stores, and income. She oversaw the training of household guards. She wrote letters to abbesses and bishops, maintaining the web of spiritual support that had long kept the people loyal to Orleans. Her words were not angry. They were calm, assuring. They reminded readers that righteousness did not need noise, only resolve. Yet beneath it all, she was afraid. She remembered England. She remembered what it meant to watch a kingdom teeter. She remembered the Tower, the whispers, the waiting. And she feared that France might now follow that same path, not all at once, but slowly. Street by street, town by town, until nothing was left of order, only ambition and fire. At night, she often sat beside Jean's cradle long after the child had fallen asleep. She would press her hand to the tiny back, feeling the breath rise and fall, rise and fall. The world she wanted for her daughter, one of letters, gardens, music, and peace, was now threatened by men in armor and words twisted into weapons. And so, Isabella did what women in her position had always done. She prayed. She planned. She endured. In early spring, she received news from Paris. A crowd had gathered outside Notre Dame Cathedral, not to worship, but to argue. Supporters of Burgundy shouted that the Duke had saved France. Others wept for the murdered Duke Louis. The royal court, paralyzed by the king's illness, issued no condemnation. And Isabella knew what that silence meant. They would have to fend for themselves. Valois transformed. The gardens were left untended. The painters stopped their work on frescoes in the chapel. Even the musicians, sensing the new solemnity, played only soft, aching tunes when summoned. Charles's days were now spent with advisers and commanders, and Isabella's with ledgers and letters. They did not see each other as often, but when they did, their time was quiet and tender. No grand speeches. Just the holding of hands, the pressing of foreheads together in silence. One afternoon, Isabella called for her scribes and dictated a letter to her cousin in Milan. The air is changing. I can feel it even in the corridors. I do not know what will become of us. But I do know this, we will not run. Not again. I have run enough in my life. If it is to be fire, let me face it with open eyes. She signed the letter not as queen, not even as duchess, but simply Isabella. By summer, the Burgundian-Armagnac civil war had begun. It did not begin with trumpets or banners, but with whispers. Alliances shifted. Taxes rose. Troops quietly moved. And soon, cities once friendly to Orleans began to close their gates. Townspeople spoke more cautiously. Children sang fewer songs in the streets. Isabella's role now became one of maintenance. She kept morale steady. She ensured the household ran smoothly, even as its masters prepared for war. She arranged for displaced families to be housed and fed. And she ensured that the chapel bells still rang each evening, a signal that peace, though shaken, was not forgotten. When Charles departed that autumn for his first major campaign, he took with him a portrait Isabella had commissioned secretly, not a formal one in gilded robes, but a simple painting of her in a garden, cradling Jean. A mother. A wife. A promise. He left her with a kiss on the brow and no words. And Isabella watched from the balcony as his banner disappeared into the woods. The days grew shorter now, and the light that filtered through the windows of Valois had taken on that autumn softness, as if the sun, too, had grown tired from the long year. The leaves on the lindens and chestnuts shifted from green to gold to rust, and in the stillness between wind gusts, Isabella could hear the crackling descent of dry leaves outside her window. It had been 6 weeks since Charles had ridden away. Each morning, Isabella rose before dawn, dressed in silence, and sat for a while at the eastern window. She would sip a cup of honeyed water while the horizon softened into gray, and then peach. Some mornings were mist-heavy, the courtyard below lost to fog, as though the whole world had been erased in the night. Other days the skies were blue, and she could see as far as the edge of the vineyards where peasants already bent over late harvest vines. No word had come from Charles in some time. And yet Isabella was not idle. There was always something to tend, supplies to inventory, petitions to review, households to oversee. She made her rounds in the kitchens, where cooks stirred great iron pots and cut loaves of coarse black bread. She spent time in the chapel, speaking quietly with Father Guillaume about the souls of those lost and the burdens of those still living. And every evening, without fail, she sat with Jean, teaching the little girl to read her first letters. Jean had begun to recognize her own name on parchment. One afternoon, while tracing a shape in the margins of a prayer book, the child had asked, "When will Papa come back?" Isabella paused, brushed a loose strand of hair from Jean's brow, and answered gently, "When the leaves are all gone, and the wind turns sharp." A soft lie, wrapped in the folds of rhythm and weather. But the truth was, no one knew. Word from the front was sparse. Letters traveled slowly, if at all. Messengers were sometimes intercepted by Burgundian sympathizers. Other times, they simply vanished on the road, victims of highwaymen or rough weather. Even the trusted courier who usually brought letters from Charles had not been seen in weeks. And so, Isabella waited. She waited the way women of her station had always waited, with dignity and patience, while silently preparing for the worst. She took up embroidery again, not for vanity, but for its rhythm. The needle rising and falling through cloth gave shape to the hours. She stitched golden lilies into the hem of a winter cloak for Jean, then began a tapestry depicting Saint Margaret with her dragon, a symbol of courage in the face of danger. The longer the silence stretched, the more Isabella learned to listen to other sounds, the faintest change in the stable's rhythm, the difference between the tread of a servant and that of a soldier, the distant bark of the hounds when something, or someone, approached. It was on a chill evening in late October that the first rider arrived. The castle gates creaked open just before dusk, and a tired horse stumbled into the courtyard, its flanks lathered, its rider slumped forward. He wore Orleans colors but was streaked with mud, his left arm wrapped in bloodied cloth. He did not dismount immediately. Instead, he raised a sealed letter with a shaking hand, as if it were a sacred object. Isabella descended the stairs herself to receive him. She took the letter silently, nodded for the grooms to tend to him, and walked slowly back inside. The wax seal was slightly cracked, the edge rain-warped, but the mark was clear, Charles's hand. Inside, the words were brief, written in haste, but his tone was steady. He was well, though the road had been hard. The campaign had seen setbacks. He missed her. He dreamed often of Blois, and of Jean's laughter. He hoped to return before winter deepened. Isabella read the letter twice, then once more aloud to herself. She closed her eyes. In that moment, it was not hope she felt, not exactly, but something older and quieter, a breath she had been holding finally exhaled. In the days that followed, more couriers arrived, carrying not only word from Charles but from the broader world. The Duke of Burgundy had occupied Paris. Riots had broken out. The Queen, Isabella's own mother, had signed some kind of agreement with Burgundy, though the details remained unclear. Even the royal children were said to be in his care now. It was, Isabella knew, the beginning of a deeper unraveling. The kingdom was no longer divided by geography, but by belief, who was loyal to whom, and why. Even longtime friends now watched each other carefully. Every conversation felt like it carried two meanings. Every dinner could be a test. Isabella instructed her secretaries to draft measured replies to all letters, never too warm, never too cold. She offered condolences for suffering, prayers for peace, and generous yet cautious reassurances of her support for France. But privately, she began writing a new journal. This journal was not for diplomacy, nor for posterity. It was a ledger of truth, where she recorded what she saw, what she suspected, and what she feared. She wrote in a cipher of her own design, a mix of Latin, Provençal, and shorthand markings borrowed from musical notation. It was meant for no one but herself, a tool of memory and clarity in a world turning increasingly unstable. She called it the Autumn Book. In its pages, she recorded the changing moods of the court, the unease among servants, the appearance of unfamiliar faces in the great hall. She noted which towns had gone quiet, which monasteries had sent fewer tithes. And she wrote of dreams, vivid, sometimes terrifying ones, where castles crumbled and rivers overflowed with the sound of weeping. But not all was shadow. There were bright threads too. A merchant from Flanders arrived with bolts of velvet the color of plum and frost. Isabella ordered a new gown, not for herself, but for Jean. She arranged for a choir of young boys to sing each Sunday in the chapel, their voices echoing upward like birds in flight. And she began a correspondence with a nun in Rouen who had written a treatise on women's leadership in Scripture, a radical notion that thrilled Isabella with its quiet defiance. She did not abandon joy. She just stored it more carefully now, like wine laid down for winter. By early November, the first frost clung to the outer gates like sugar. Inside, fires burned constantly. Isabella oversaw the stockpiling of wool, the salting of meats, the sharpening of tools. She added extra coin to the wages of stable hands and gave thick cloaks to the castle guards. This was how one prepared for war in winter, not with trumpets, but with blankets and bread. On the eve of St. Martin's Day, Isabella stood at the battlements, looking east. The moon was thin, pale. Below her, the Loire moved slowly between its banks, carrying fallen leaves like silent prayers. She folded her hands. And in the hush between night and morning, she whispered a name, not in fear, not even in longing, but in quiet remembrance. Charles. And somewhere far beyond the misted hills he rode on. Winter had begun in earnest by the time the news reached Valois. Snow had come early, silencing the fields and softening the outlines of the trees. Fires burned low in the hearths, and even the great hall seemed smaller, as if the stone itself had shrunk away from the cold. It was mid-morning when the messenger arrived, not on horseback, but in a simple cart drawn by two steady mules. The man who carried the letter wore no colors, no livery, no signet ring. Only a frostbitten cloak and a face that looked too young for such grim work. He handed the letter directly to Isabella's steward, saying only, "It is from Calais. From the north." Isabella read the letter in silence. It was from a nun at the Abbey of St. Mary's, a place that had once received bread and coin from Richard II himself. The words were gentle but unflinching. The enclosed document was a copied, the nun said, from a witness's account in Flanders. Richard of Bordeaux, former King of England, was dead. The final confirmation. Isabella sat for a long time afterward, her eyes on the snowy garden just beyond the glass. It was not unexpected. Rumors had circled for months, about his disappearance, about a possible death at Pontefract. Some had whispered that he had been starved. Others said he had been stabbed in the dark by those too afraid to let him live. But none had been sure. Now they were. She did not cry at first. She had cried, once, in the Tower of London, and since then her tears had become rare and measured things. Instead, she pressed her fingers to the sealed copy of the death statement, and whispered softly in French. "He was kind to me." And that was true. Richard had never been a man she loved in the way of ballads or courtly verse. But he had been the first face in a foreign land. The first to kneel before her and call her, "My Queen." He had read poetry aloud when she was too frightened to sleep. He had given her violets in winter. He had tried, in his own way, to be a gentle husband to a frightened child. And now he was gone. Later that day, Isabella withdrew to the chapel. She instructed the monks to say Mass not as a state funeral, but as a quiet requiem. No flags. No heralds. Just candles, and a small chalice of wine, and prayers spoken in low, even voices. She sat at the back of the nave, cloaked in black, her gloved hands clasped tightly. The carved saints above the altar looked down with unreadable expressions, wood and stone offering a kind of eternal, indifferent witness. She stayed long after the service ended. She remained while the monks folded their robes and disappeared through side doors. She stayed while the acolytes extinguished the last candles. Only the red sanctuary lamp flickered now. The shadows pressed closer. But she did not move. There, in the hush, she let herself remember. Not the crown, not the pomp, not the carefully rehearsed titles. Just the man who had once asked her what kind of birds lived near the Seine. The man who had once said he feared being forgotten, not as a king, but as a soul. "He is not forgotten," she said aloud. That evening, Isabella wrote 3 letters. One to her mother, reporting Richard's confirmed death. One to her father's council, requesting a modest memorial be added to the Cathedral of Senators, and one to herself, tucked into the pages of the Autumn Book, where her truest voice could speak without consequence. In it she wrote, "I see now that kings are not only made of iron and silk, but also of smoke and memory. He ruled, he fell, he suffered. And he has passed into silence. But I remember. That is enough." The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. Word of Richard's death reached the French court by slower channels. Some mourned in political tones, regretting the loss of an ally. Others spoke of opportunity. With Richard gone, the ties binding England and France had weakened further. There were new talks of treaties, of remarriage, of realignments. Isabella received several letters of condolence from unlikely sources. One came from a former English lady-in-waiting, now married to a French knight near Rouen. Another came anonymously, written in an elegant hand, simply saying, "He was not perfect, but he was ours. May you find peace." Isabella kept them all. And yet, there was a shifting inside her, subtle at first, then firmer. A realization that the chapter of her life that had begun in a candlelit chamber in Winchester was now closed. She was no longer a queen in waiting. No longer a child bride under protection. She was a widow. A free woman. Or so it seemed. Freedom, she knew, was a slippery thing. It depended not only on titles, but on choices, and those choices were rarely hers alone. Her mother began suggesting new suitors. Gentlemen from Savoy. Princes from Aragon. Even a cardinal's brother was mentioned in passing, though Isabella quickly refused. She thanked her mother politely, but firmly. Not yet. Not now. Instead, she began traveling again, short trips to nearby abbeys, pilgrimages to quiet shrines. She visited Fontevraud, where Eleanor of Aquitaine had once walked the cloisters. She spent several nights at Saint Benoît-sur-Loire, where monks had copied prayers older than any king's reign. In these sacred spaces, she found breath again. She met women who had never been queens, who had never seen court intrigue, but who knew the rhythm of devotion, of silence, of selfhood carved not by politics but by prayer. They reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten. That she, too, was made of more than treaties. One cold morning at a wayside chapel, Isabella watched a nun light a single candle. It flickered, small and thin, against the gray stone. "That is all we do, really," the nun said, noticing Isabella's gaze. "Light a bit of flame, and hope it holds back the dark." Isabella nodded slowly. "Yes," she thought. "That is all we do." By the time she returned to Blois, spring was beginning to whisper beneath the frost. Buds had begun to nudge at branches. The doves returned to the eaves. And Isabella, for the first time in years, did not feel like someone in waiting. She stood one morning at her writing desk, drew fresh parchment, and began a letter, not to a king, or a diplomat, or a suitor, but to herself. A letter about beginnings. About dignity. About the soft power of women who survive. The ink flowed easily. And the candle burned steady. The river Loire shimmered in the pale light of early spring, its surface catching the sky in soft, broken reflections. Along its banks, the buds of young poplars were beginning to stretch open. Farmers cleared winter's debris from their fields. Children walked barefoot near the reeds. The world was waking up. And so was Isabella. By now, she had grown used to the rhythm of Blois, the quiet mornings, the calls of doves in the rafters, the scent of bread baking in distant kitchens. It was not the life of a queen, but it was peaceful. In that peace, Isabella had begun to imagine a future not built on political exchange, but on selfhood. And yet, as always, history had other plans. He arrived just after noon, his cloak dusty from the road, his horses flecked with mud. Charles of Orleans, her cousin, the son of her father's brother. She had known him as a boy, remembered him chasing dogs through the corridors of the Louvre, remembered him once gifting her a painted shell from the banks of the Seine. But this man was older, taller, dressed in sable and embroidered wool. His face carried both gentleness and the quiet gravity of a nobleman shaped by conflict. He bowed before her in the hall of Blois, not with the flourish of a courtier, but the solemn grace of someone offering something real. "Isabella," he said, "may I speak plainly?" She inclined her head. "Yes. I prefer plainness." He smiled, not broadly, but enough to soften his features. "I would ask for your hand." She did not answer immediately. A hawk's cry echoed from somewhere beyond the windows. The stone walls of Blois did not tremble, but Isabella felt a shift inside herself, the kind that does not come from surprise, but from inevitability finally knocking at the door. Later that day, she walked the gallery alone, thinking. Marriage. She had lived it once, not in the way most women did, but in the cold, ritual way of queens and kingdoms. A child in a velvet gown. A husband who read poems and then died behind the walls of Pontefract. And now, another proposal. From a man not yet 30. who wrote verses in the margins of his books and knew the names of trees in both Latin and French. A man who, unlike Richard, did not need her to complete his reign, but who seemed to want her to complete his life. She thought of Charles's hands. Not soft, like a prince who had never lifted more than a goblet, but worn slightly at the knuckles, the hands of a man who wrote, who lived with intention. She remembered how he had looked at her, not as a queen, not even as a widow, but as a woman. That evening, they met again in the long hall, this time without attendants. The fire burned low, casting orange patterns across the stone floor. "I do not offer power," he said gently. "You already have that, in your own quiet way. I offer presence. A place beside me. Nothing more, and nothing less." Isabella folded her hands in her lap. "And what if history comes for us again? What if the peace crumbles, and we find ourselves back in the fire?" Charles did not hesitate. "Then we burn together." And somehow, that answer felt like the first honest promise she had heard in years. She did not reply aloud. Instead, she reached for the carafe on the nearby table, poured 2 cups of wine, and handed one to him. A silent gesture. A beginning. The engagement was announced within the week. There was no parade. No trumpets. Just a quiet notice delivered to the French court, and a flicker of excitement among those who had long watched Isabella's fate with interest. To some, this was merely a safe match, 2 cousins joining houses, tying off a loose thread of royal blood. To others, it was the careful stitching of a new tapestry, Isabella, the widow queen, choosing to marry not for politics, but for something deeper. The wedding was scheduled for early summer, in the cathedral at Paris. But before it, Isabella insisted on a journey. She wanted to return, briefly, to the places that had shaped her. The convent where she had studied Latin. The small shrine where she had once lit a candle for Richard. The garden in Tours where violets still bloomed in early June. She wanted to gather herself, to walk the path that had brought her here. At each stop she wrote. Small notes. Tiny folded papers left behind in corners. A letter to her younger self, hidden inside a carved bench. A verse to her mother, tucked behind a votive candle. Words to Richard, scratched softly into the margin of a psalter. I did not forget, but I am walking forward. When she returned to Paris, the city was buzzing. Preparations were simple but elegant. Blue and gold banners hung over the cathedral gates. Candles were placed in every chapel alcove. Her gown was woven of silken damask, a dusky rose color that caught the light and deepened at the seams. Her veil was embroidered with lilies, not as a symbol of royal lineage, but of renewal. Charles waited at the altar in a robe of charcoal gray, his eyes calm, steady. As Isabella stepped into the cathedral, the hush fell over the crowd. Not a queen now, not a child. A woman. Whole, weathered, and luminous with her own light. When they spoke their vows, it was not in the elevated language of monarchs. No claims of dominion. No pompous phrases about dynasties. Only this. I will not rule over you. I will walk beside you. The words rang softly, like bells after a storm. And when they kissed, it was not the ceremonial gesture of treaties sealed, but something deeply human, quiet, long, and warm. That night, the feast was held in the courtyard of the ducal palace. Music played. Peaches were served with honey. Children danced in the torchlight. Isabella wore her hair down for the first time in public since her childhood. She laughed, not softly, but fully, richly, as though some weight had fallen from her shoulders. And across the table, Charles watched her, not as a husband watches a wife he has acquired, but as a man watches the sunrise after years of cloud. Later, in their private chambers, Isabella sat at her writing desk by the window. The moon was rising over the city. The candles had all burned low. She opened a fresh sheet of parchment, and wrote only this. Let this be the beginning not of a story told by others, but of one I shaped with my own hands. I was once a queen, once a prisoner, once a child sold to peace. But now, I am simply myself. And for the first time, that is enough. Then she folded the paper, blew out the flame, and climbed into bed beside the man she had chosen. Not for crown, not for country, but for the quiet of two lives joined in equal measure, and for the promise of peace, not between kingdoms, but within the heart. Morning light filtered through the high windows of Valois, softening the stone corridors and cloaking the quiet halls in a gauzy glow. The birds in the trees outside stirred, their faint melodies weaving through the air like threads of peace. Within her chambers, Isabella rose slowly. Not because she had slept poorly, but because her body, now softened by motherhood and burdened by years of emotional weight, no longer moved with the ease it once had. She walked barefoot across the woven carpet, pausing by the cradle to gaze at her sleeping daughter. Jean, small, delicate, and serene. The child had come into the world with little noise, but with great purpose. And in her, Isabella saw not just hope for the future, but a tether to the present. These were the quiet years. Or so it seemed. At court, Isabella and Charles cultivated not just a marriage but a sanctuary. Theirs was a household filled with music, poetry, and the laughter of courtiers whose wit had not yet been dulled by bloodshed. Scholars came from Italy, bringing manuscripts wrapped in cloth. Illuminators sat by tall windows, copying histories and romances into gold-leaf books. In the evenings, Isabella sometimes joined Charles in the reading hall, their chairs angled toward the fire, each absorbed in their own thoughts yet content in the other's company. But outside the high walls of their court, the world trembled. Henry IV still sat upon England's throne, though uneasily. Rebellions rose in Wales and northern England. Old loyalties frayed. And whispers from abroad told of strained alliances, heavy taxes, and a king haunted by his own conscience. France, too, was restless. King Charles VI, Isabella's father, remained locked in cycles of lucidity and madness. During his moments of clarity, he called for peace, for stability, for unity. But when the shadows returned to his mind, he became unreachable, a monarch only in title. In his absence, 100 voices rose to fill the vacuum. Isabella had seen such patterns before. She remembered England in the days before Richard's fall, the subtle shifts of tone, the quiet dismissals, the calculated exiles. She remembered the way power had moved like smoke, visible only when caught in the right light. Now, in France, she saw it again. And though she had no desire to re-enter the political stage, it seemed politics had not forgotten her. At dinners, noblewomen leaned close to ask her opinion on certain lords. In letters, distant duchesses inquired about her memories of English diplomacy. Ambassadors brought folded scrolls asking for her insights into border skirmishes. Slowly, subtly, her name returned to court conversation, not as a queen, not even as a widow, but as a woman whose presence still meant something. Charles encouraged her. "You see more than most," he told her one night, as she poured wine from a silver pitcher. "You have lived in both courts. You understand how men think when they are frightened. Use that." But Isabella hesitated. She had used her knowledge before, and it had left her locked in a tower, watching guards patrol beneath her barred windows. She did not fear politics, but she feared what it did to people. Even so, she did not turn away entirely. She agreed to advise Charles in quiet moments. When he traveled to meet with other nobles, she prepared him with histories of their families, old debts, lingering grudges. When correspondence came from England, she translated with care, watching for subtle shifts in tone, noting who used the word queen and who did not. And all the while, she remained a mother. Jean's early years were filled with laughter and lullabies. Isabella insisted that she be raised with gentleness, not like a pawn, but like a child. Tutors were chosen not for their titles, but for their kindness. Isabella sat beside her daughter during lessons, tracing letters in soft sand, reciting old French ballads, sometimes slipping into English rhymes without thinking. She did not want Jean to grow up feeling torn between worlds, as she herself had. But peace does not last long in fractured kingdoms. By the time Jean was 2 years old, the rift in France was impossible to ignore. The Duke of Burgundy, powerful, ambitious, began challenging the authority of the royal family. His influence stretched across Paris, into the hearts of merchants, the pockets of soldiers, and even into parts of the royal council. Meanwhile, Charles's father, the elder Duke of Orleans, claimed the role of regent during the king's illness. The two men were not just rivals, they were ideologically opposed. Burgundy stood for tight control and northern interests. Orleans, and by extension, Isabella's household, supported reform, art, diplomacy, and a softer form of rule. The court fractured, and Isabella, who had hoped to remain above the fray, found herself once again at the heart of a brewing storm. She began receiving threats. Anonymous letters slid beneath her doors. Unmarked riders seen along the roads leading to Blois. Rumors spread that she had spies in the English court, absurd, but persistent. Charles tightened security. Guards doubled. Servants sworn to secrecy. Late-night meetings became routine. And still, Isabella did not waver. She would walk through the corridors of their estate with her head high, Jean on one hip, a letter from Paris in her other hand. She did not flinch when Burgundy's name was spoken. She did not hide her views. But privately she began to prepare. She organized her household records, inventories, heirlooms, dowry items, not because she expected to leave, but because she knew one must always be ready to. She reviewed her marriage contract, quietly confirming her rights. She met with trusted monks and instructed them to safeguard certain manuscripts and personal documents, should anything happen. And in the stillest hour of the night she wrote in her journal, "Once I lived behind a wall and watched the kingdom change without me. Never again. If the storm comes, let it come with eyes open." That storm arrived sooner than expected. In the winter of 1407, her father-in-law, the elder Duke of Orleans, was murdered in the streets of Paris. Struck down in daylight, his body left in the snow. The assassins were linked to the Duke of Burgundy, though no official accusation would come for months. The news reached Isabella as she rocked Jean to sleep. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She handed the child to her nursemaid, walked to the hearth, and sat in silence for nearly an hour. Then she stood and summoned her steward. "We will have visitors," she said simply. "Prepare the guest chambers. And send word to Charles. He will need me." When Charles returned 3 days later, his eyes were shadowed and red. He embraced Isabella in the snow-covered courtyard, pressing his forehead to hers. "We are at war," he whispered. And she, holding him tightly, whispered back, "Then we will walk through it together." The chapter of peace was over. But in the quiet strength of their bond, in the silent resolve that passed between them, Isabella was no longer the girl locked in a tower. She was a duchess, a mother, a survivor, and now, perhaps, a leader. The snow had not yet melted from the rooftops of Blois when the first wave of morning cloaked the duchy like a funeral shroud. Black banners fluttered from the towers. The gates stood closed, save for messengers arriving from every corner of France. In the great hall, the hearth roared with fire, but the warmth did not chase away the tension that now hung in every corner of the court. Isabella moved through the corridors with quiet purpose. Her gown, dark blue, embroidered with black lilies, swept silently behind her. Her daughter, Jean, watched her mother with wide eyes, asking softly, "Why do people whisper so much now, Mama?" Isabella offered a tired smile. "Because they are afraid. But we must teach them how to breathe again." The murder of her father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, had not merely shocked the nobility, it had shattered the illusion of stability. There was no more hiding behind etiquette or poetic gatherings. This was no longer courtly rivalry, it was political war. Isabella felt the shift immediately. Where once there had been salons and sonnets, now there were secret meetings and coded letters. Where music once played in the gardens, now guards stood at every gate. She found herself waking in the night to muffled voices and hurried footsteps, couriers from Paris, nobles seeking alliance, families fleeing the capital. The Duchy of Orleans had become a fortress. Charles had changed too. Grief weighed heavily on his face, though he rarely spoke of it. Isabella would find him in the library, standing at the window with a letter still clutched in his hand, or in the chapel, his head bowed not in prayer but in brooding silence. He no longer sang with the musicians. He no longer laughed at courtly jesters. Isabella tried to reach him with tenderness, with long walks in the garden, with memories of their daughter's first words. But he remained distant, not cruel, never cruel, but locked in a resolve that frightened her more than sorrow ever could. "My father was murdered," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Paris applauds?" Isabella, seated beside him, reached for his hand. "Then let us teach Paris to mourn." But vengeance was already stirring in the halls of power. The Duke of Burgundy, Jean Sans-Père, John the Fearless, denied responsibility, of course. Publicly, he claimed the murder had been a matter of justice, not ambition. That the elder Orleans had conspired to corrupt the king, that his removal was necessary for the salvation of France. The court split in two. On one side, the Burgundians, pragmatic, northern, wealthy. On the other, the Armagnacs, supporters of Orleans drawn from the southern nobility, the intellectuals, and the reformers. Though Isabella despised the labels, she knew which banner her family now stood beneath. And so, they prepared. Charles gathered troops and sent emissaries to southern France. The ducal finances were reviewed, fortresses restocked, alliances renewed. And Isabella, no longer just Duchess by title, became Duchess by action. She took charge of the internal affairs of Valois. The household accounts, the letters, the courtly diplomacy. She established councils to oversee grain storage, refugee relief, and the care of orphans now swelling the city gates. She met personally with widows of men already killed in border skirmishes. She saw the war not just in banners and names, but in the tired eyes of women, the hunger in children, and the silence that fell over villages where husbands had once sung at harvest. Isabella's days became long and tightly bound in purpose. At dawn, she reviewed reports from outposts. At noon, she dined with ambassadors. In the evenings, she tended her children, Jean and little Charles, soothing them with lullabies as her own voice grew hoarse from negotiations and planning. Yet even amidst the shadow of civil war, there were quiet moments that preserved her spirit. One afternoon, as snow melted in tiny streams across the courtyard, she found Jean drawing on the stone with bits of charcoal. "Is that a castle?" Isabella asked. Jean looked up proudly. "It is Blois. And that is you." She pointed to a figure wearing a crown, standing above the gates. "Why am I up so high?" Isabella asked softly. "So you can see all the people," Jean replied, "and keep them safe." The answer stayed with Isabella for days. She had once been a symbol of peace, a child bride meant to unite two kingdoms. That dream had faded. But perhaps she could still be a symbol of protection. Not for empires, but for this corner of France that now depended on her. In Paris, the situation deteriorated. Riots broke out in the marketplaces. Merchants fled. The royal court, what remained of it, had become a battlefield of words and knives. The king was seldom lucid. And the queen, Isabella's own mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was said to be leaning toward Burgundy, desperate to preserve her own influence amidst the chaos. Isabella did not speak of her mother much anymore. She still wrote letters, courteous, restrained, but received little warmth in return. She no longer expected comfort from her family. The years had taught her that loyalty and blood were not always intertwined. She found solace instead in her household, in her children, her staff, and in Charles, who, though hardened by grief, still returned to her chambers each night. Sometimes he would sit beside her in silence, his hand finding hers under the cover of night. "I am tired of blood," he confessed one evening, "but I do not know how to stop the river once it begins." Isabella looked at him for a long time. "Then we build bridges, one stone at a time." That spring, Isabella began sending emissaries of her own, not just soldiers, but peace brokers. She wrote carefully worded appeals to neutral nobles, encouraging them to shelter civilians, to maintain trade routes, to remember that even in war, dignity must survive. She arranged meetings between clerics who had once opposed one another, encouraging dialogue on reforms rather than reprisals. Quietly, she supported scholars and poets, commissioning works that celebrated harmony, shared heritage, and the old days of a united court. Some called her naive, others dangerously idealistic. But her influence grew nonetheless. And as summer approached, a new rumor began to circulate, one that surprised even Isabella. That she, Isabella of Valois, Duchess of Orleans, might one day serve as regent. Not because she claimed power, but because she understood suffering. Because she spoke in ways that calmed rather than provoked. Because her life had mirrored France's, once glorious, then broken, now rebuilding. She dismissed the rumor at first. But in her heart she felt something stir, not ambition, but duty. A sense that she was no longer simply a figure moved by history, but perhaps, at last, a hand upon its wheel. And so the chapter ended, not with triumph, nor tragedy, but with resolve. In the dusk-lit chambers of a duchy poised between war and hope, Isabella stood not as a widow, not as a child queen, not as a grieving noblewoman, but as a quiet force of resilience. She had not sought power, but when it came knocking, she had not turned it away. The year turned again, and with it came a different kind of chill, not the frost of winter, but the tension of a kingdom slowly unraveling at its seams. As dawn broke through the narrow windows of Blois, pale light filtered onto a room filled with ledgers, maps, and unopened letters. Isabella, now 21, sat in her writing chair beside the fire, wrapped in a mantle of wool and thought. Sleep came irregularly now, broken by the sounds of messengers tapping at the gates or the haunting memories that rose when the house lay quiet. But when she did sleep, she dreamed not of war, nor of England, but of water, rivers twisting through quiet hills, undisturbed and constant, untouched by the struggles of men. Outside the stone walls, however, that peace remained a distant longing. The murder of her father-in-law, the Duke of Orleans, had ignited a civil war that refused to burn out. France was cleaved down its spine. Cities pledged allegiance to one faction or the other, and those that tried to stay neutral found themselves occupied, pillaged, or punished by both sides. And through it all, Isabella had not wavered. While Charles rode to battle, she ruled in his stead, quietly, competently, and with a kind of moral authority that neither sword nor blood could manufacture. Nobles who had once dismissed her as a foreign girl, a decorative queen once married to an English king, now found themselves writing to her for advice. Monks praised her wisdom. Townspeople whispered of her kindness. And her court began to resemble something rare in these turbulent years, stability. One morning, as Isabella walked slowly through the gardens of Blois, the frost melting gently on dormant hedges, she was met by Abbot Jean of Tours, a trusted adviser whose counsel she often sought. "You have built something remarkable," he said, bowing with the kind of reverence once reserved for kings. Isabella smiled, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. "I have only kept it from falling." "No," the abbot replied gently. "You have helped it rise." He paused before continuing. "There are those who believe you should lead, not just here, in Blois, but further." Isabella turned to look at him, the wind catching the edge of her cloak. "Lead what, father?" "The regency." The words hung in the air, heavy as iron. Isabella stood still, the sound of crows faint in the distance. The idea was not new. She had heard it whispered in salons and in candlelit hallways. With King Charles VI descending ever deeper into madness, and with the Queen Consort, Isabel, having lost the trust of many due to her shifting alliances, a void had opened in the governance of France. A void that needed filling, not by ambition, but by wisdom. And many believed Isabella of Valois, once Queen of England, now Duchess of Orleans, had become the most trusted woman in the realm. But the thought unsettled her. She did not desire power. She desired peace. And regency was a burden carried not in robes and titles, but in sleepless nights and impossible choices. That evening she wrote in her diary, the ink freezing slightly at the tip of her quill. "I was not raised for this. I was raised to be quiet, to smile at the right time, to bear dynasties on my back. But I have learned painfully that silence is not always virtue, that peace is not passive, that leadership is not about commanding, but about listening when others do not. Her son Charles was now old enough to study alongside tutors from neighboring duchies. Isabella insisted on attending many of his lessons, not to interfere, but to listen, to remind herself of what the future might hold if nurtured carefully. She taught him what she wished someone had taught her, not just court etiquette or heraldry, but compassion, discernment, and the strength of listening more than speaking. On the rare occasions Charles returned from campaign, he found in Isabella not just the mother of his children, but an equal. He would read her reports in silence, then ask, "How did you think to do this?" She would simply shrug. Because it was needed. Sometimes they would walk along the river banks at twilight, their boots crunching over pebbled frost, speaking of politics, poetry, and philosophy, a quiet marriage of minds that comforted them both in uncertain times. But not all welcomed Isabella's rise. The Burgundians spread whispers that she manipulated her husband, that she harbored secret loyalties to England, that she used the veil of widowhood to disguise ambition. Even some in her own faction were cautious, wary of a woman whose voice now carried weight equal to theirs. But Isabella remained undeterred. She answered not with proclamations, but with progress. In her duchy, taxes were adjusted to protect the poor during failed harvests. Schools were expanded. Bridges were repaired. Monasteries received parchment and ink to copy texts long forgotten in the fires of war. And most importantly, her doors remained open. Peasants, tradesmen, merchants, all found audience with the Duchess of Orleans. Not always quickly, not always with immediate remedy, but they were heard. And sometimes being heard was enough to restore hope. One afternoon, a small boy was brought before her, his hair dusted with road dirt, his eyes far older than his years. He had walked from a ruined village, seeking his father who had been conscripted and never returned. Isabella knelt beside him, brushing mud from his cheek. "What is your name?" He whispered it, too softly for the court to hear. She ordered that he be fed, clothed, and given safe passage back to any remaining kin. But she kept the name. Later, she had it embroidered into the lining of her writing chair, a quiet vow to remember that war, at its heart, was not about borders or banners, but about lives like his. And it was lives, not politics, that gave her strength. In late spring, as the snows retreated into memory, Isabella made her decision. She would not seize the regency. But neither would she shrink from it if offered. She drafted a letter, measured, firm, compassionate, addressed to the King's Council. It stated simply that if her service was deemed necessary, she would answer. That she would serve not for power, but for continuity. Not for titles, but for peace. The message was received with mixed response. But for the people, the ones who plowed fields, who stitched boots, who watched sons vanish into wars they did not understand, the response was clear. They began calling her La Reine Douce, the gentle queen. Not because she wore a crown, but because she embodied what they wished a queen could be. And so, as summer unfurled across France, as the rivers began to swell with melted snow and the wind carried the scent of lavender through the valleys, Isabella remained in her place, at her writing desk, beside the fire, building something not yet fully formed. Not a throne. Not a regime. But a rhythm. A different kind of rain, one made not of marble and trumpets, but of parchment, patience, and quiet resolve. She knew storms would come. But she also knew how to wait. How to plant seeds in the cold, believing that spring would one day come again. The year was 1410. In the darkened halls of Blois, even the stones seemed to breathe more heavily. Summer had long since faded, and a gray, endless drizzle hung over the land like a shroud. Inside, firelight danced gently over embroidered tapestries and polished wood, but outside, in the streets, in the fields, in the villages, France was beginning to buckle. The war that had once seemed a distant affair between nobles was now being carried into the kitchens of bakers and the cradles of infants. And Isabella, no longer merely Duchess of Orleans, found herself drifting into a role far more fragile and perilous, protector of a broken realm's conscience. By now, Charles had fully embraced his mantle as leader of the Orleans faction. The assassination of his father had lit a fire in his heart that could not be extinguished by prayer or politics. He spoke of honor, of justice, of righting the murder that had taken from him both parent and peace. But Isabella, sitting quietly in the solar with letters from across France spread before her, saw something different. She saw blood. And she feared where this path would lead. One evening, she and Charles stood on the battlements of their chateau, the mist wrapping around them like gauze. Below, soldiers moved in rows, practicing drills with pikes and crossbows. "They are ready," Charles said softly, his voice full of conviction. "The time has come." Isabella turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "And if the time never ends, Charles? If every sword we draw carves a deeper wound?" He looked at her, but said nothing. She knew he hurt her. But she also knew he could not stop. Not now. Not yet. Isabella's role had become one of quiet mediation. While Charles forged alliances with eastern provinces and the Duke of Berry, Isabella wrote careful letters to abbots and barons, to minor lords and city guilds, urging them to remain calm, to send grain to the starving, to keep their borders open for refugees. She was not naive. She knew diplomacy could not undo murder. But she believed, with every candle she lit before bed, with every vow whispered beside her sleeping children, that a thread of mercy could still be stitched through this torn tapestry. That belief would be tested again and again. In the spring of 1411, a band of mercenaries loyal to Burgundy swept through the Loire Valley, sacking several towns loyal to the Orleans cause. Survivors fled toward Blois, many arriving with frostbitten feet and hollow eyes. Isabella insisted they be taken in. For days the courtyards overflowed with people, peasants and potters, women with infants, old men muttering prayers, children who would not speak. Isabella personally directed the kitchens, ordered straw beds laid in the stables, and stood beside her steward as he redistributed stores meant for the winter. One of her ladies whispered that it was dangerous, that the duchy could not feed so many. Isabella replied only, "Then we shall eat less." At night, she sat beside the sick and wounded. She held the hands of women who had lost husbands, spoke gently to boys who had seen villages burn, and sang lullabies in 2 languages to children too traumatized to sleep. She became, for these displaced souls, not a duchess, but a comforter. A fire in the cold. A voice that still believed in good. But the burden was immense. In private, Isabella began to fray. She slept little. Letters piled on her desk faster than she could read them. Her eldest daughter grew more anxious by the day, sensing the storms swirling around their once gentle home. One morning, Isabella stood before her mirror and saw the changes written on her own face. New lines carved by grief. Shadows under her eyes where laughter used to live. She ran her fingers along the edge of her cheekbone and whispered to her reflection, "We are still standing." And that, she reminded herself, was no small thing. Yet even as she clung to that dignity, France moved further toward collapse. The king, Charles VI, fell deeper into madness, often unable to recognize even his own wife. The queen, Isabel, now ruled in name, but her alliances shifted like weather, and trust in her decisions eroded daily. In Paris, power was no longer held by crown or council, but by mobs. Riots broke out over bread. Mercenaries hired by rival factions clashed in the streets. Children played with broken weapons, mimicking the violence of their elders. Rumors of English interference, whispers of spies and bribes, added fuel to every fire. In this atmosphere of fear and fury, Isabella received a letter. Not from a noble, but from a woman in Rouen, a midwife, who had once served at court and now lived in hiding. The letter was brief. "Madam, the old world has cracked. Be cautious. They do not hate war. They only love it when it wears your face." Isabella read the words aloud to herself, again and again. She knew what they meant. Her position, as a woman of influence, as a figure from 2 royal houses, made her a symbol. And symbols, in times of chaos, were as dangerous as swords. Still, she did not retreat. In the fall of that same year, she traveled, discreetly, to Chartres, meeting with a circle of moderate nobles who believed a path to peace might still exist. She sat beside aging bishops, weary generals, and exhausted envoys. She listened to proposals, weighed options, and offered suggestions in a voice that never trembled. "Enough kings have died," she said at one point. "Let it not be children next." Her words made little impact on policy, but they shifted something subtler, a sense that someone still cared not for conquest, but for healing. Back at Blois, Isabella turned her attention to her children once more. She began keeping a journal for them, not a formal chronicle, but a quiet reflection. She recorded small stories from their infancy, lessons she hoped they would remember, names of people who had shown kindness, prayers in the margins. In one entry she wrote, "There may come a day when you are asked to choose between loyalty and compassion, between justice and mercy, between silence and truth. I cannot tell you what to choose. But I beg you, remember the faces of those who have no choice at all." These were the teachings she passed to them. Not strategies, not bloodlines, but conscience. By the close of 1412, Isabella had come to see her purpose not as ending the war, for she knew she could not, but as carrying light through it. A torch through fog. A lullaby sung through thunder. The world would not remember every letter she wrote, or every refugee she sheltered, or every night she spent kneeling by her children's beds with a candle in hand, whispering Latin blessings into the dark. But those moments mattered. And if nothing else, she hoped they would matter to her children. One evening, as snow fell gently outside and silence blanketed the chateau, Isabella stood in the corridor, listening to the sounds of sleep behind each door. The hush of her daughter's breath. The murmur of guards changing posts. The rustle of wind in the chimney. She closed her eyes, placed a hand on the cool stone wall, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that peace was possible. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. The winter of 1413 arrived not as a storm, but as a silence. It crept slowly across France, sealing rivers with ice, dusting rooftops with fine frost, and muffling the sound of even the busiest cities. Snow drifted in quiet spirals through the courtyards of Blois, and the stone walls, so often echoing with the voices of courtiers and children, now held their breath. Inside those walls, Isabella moved with careful intention. She was 23 now, still young by the measure of time, but seasoned by years that had reshaped her heart. Her health, once robust, was now like thin parchment, strong when dry, fragile when damp. The complications of her last childbirth had left her weakened, and her physicians insisted she rest more. But Isabella found no peace in stillness. Her restlessness was not of the body, but of the soul. France remained divided. The blood feud between the House of Orleans and the House of Burgundy had reached a fever pitch. Cities declared allegiance not to king or crown, but to one faction or the other. And all the while, Charles VI, her father, sat in his royal chambers, lost in a fog that no council could clear. Isabella had tried to stay above it all. She had hoped that by focusing on her children, her household, and her letters to foreign courts, she could preserve something of the old world, the gentler one she remembered from the halls of Westminster. But now, the war pressed too close. One night in January, Charles returned from a council in Bourges with a weary look on his face. He removed his gloves, one finger at a time, and sat beside the hearth without a word. Isabella waited. Finally, he said, "They want me to march on Paris." She did not answer right away. The logs crackled in the fire. "Will you?" she asked. "I do not know," he replied. "The Duke of Burgundy is there. The people claim to follow him. But our allies say they will abandon us if we hesitate." Isabella reached across and took his hand. It was colder than the stone beneath her feet. "You were never made for sieges, Charles." He looked at her then, not as a prince or a warrior, but as a man uncertain of the path ahead. "I was not made for any of this," he admitted. "But I must do it." She understood. Leadership was not born from desire, but from necessity. And those who led because they must, not because they craved power, bore its weight most honorably. The months that followed were ones of preparation. Soldiers drilled in the outer courtyards again. Blacksmiths worked late into the night, forging arrowheads and fitting armor. Isabella oversaw the provisioning of supplies, not just food and weapons, but parchment for letters, candles for chapels, linen for the wounded. She wrote dozens of missives during that time, to abbots and merchants, to duchesses and distant cousins, always urging calm, compromise, restraint. She signed each one with the same phrase, "In hope, we endure." But hope was in short supply. Rumors came daily. That Burgundy had ordered the massacre of Orleans sympathizers in Paris. That English envoys were meeting with both sides, eager to exploit the chaos. That the king had suffered another spell and no longer recognized his own seal. Isabella's nights grew sleepless again. She took to walking the halls long after her children were asleep. Sometimes she would stop outside their doors and listen, just to assure herself that they were breathing. That they still belonged to this quieter world of dreams and lullabies. One such night she descended into the chapel, her slippered feet silent on the stone steps. She lit a single candle at the altar and knelt. But her prayer did not come. Instead, she sat there, her hands folded, eyes wide open, as if waiting for the silence to answer first. In the days of her girlhood, she had believed that kings were protectors, that marriage meant security, that alliances could ensure peace. Now she knew better. Kings died. Marriages became bargaining chips. Alliances were written on water. But still, something in her resisted despair. Perhaps it was the memory of Richard reading poetry aloud in the English gardens. Perhaps it was the way Charles held their daughter's hand as she learned to walk. Perhaps it was the letter she had once received from an unknown villager, thanking her for sheltering their family when the Burgundians attacked. Whatever it was, Isabella could not let go of it. She called it hope. Even when it hurt. When spring came, it brought not flowers, but war. Charles marched on Paris in April. This siege did not last long. The people, weary and hungry, opened the gates before the fighting could begin in earnest. But the city they entered was no longer whole. Fear clung to the walls. Suspicion filled the taverns. Families whispered of neighbors who had vanished in the night. The Duke of Burgundy had fled north, but his shadow remained. Charles tried to restore order. He issued proclamations, pardons, promises. Isabella came to Paris a few weeks later, her children kept behind in Blois for safety. She entered the capital with little ceremony, dressed not in royal finery, but in a gown of deep gray wool, her hair veiled. Yet the people recognized her. Some bowed. Some watched silently. One old woman cried. Isabella spent her days walking the markets, visiting bakeries, speaking with weavers and scribes. She asked questions. She listened. She offered no answers. One child offered her a piece of bread and said, "Are you the lady who sends letters?" She smiled. "Yes," she said. "I am." That summer, a fragile calm settled over France. It was not peace, but it was pause. Isabella returned to Blois and found her son reading aloud to his sister. He looked up when she entered and said, "I want to learn Latin next." She laughed for the first time in weeks. That night she sat beneath the stars, her hands folded in her lap, and whispered a new prayer. Not for victory. Not for power. Just for time. More time. To raise her children. To repair what had been broken. To teach them that loyalty did not mean blindness. That love did not mean silence. That endurance, even when quiet and unseen, was its own kind of triumph. In the end, she thought, perhaps that was all any of them could do. Carry the light forward, even when the road vanished beneath their feet. The final years of Isabella's life were not marked by grandeur, nor by final victories. They were, instead, quiet, marked by introspection, gentle rituals, and the long fading of a woman who had carried the weight of kingdoms before she had ever turned 12. It was a different kind of power now. Not the power of courts or crowns or politics, but the soft, enduring power of memory and presence. By the spring of 1415, the court at Blois had grown smaller. Some courtiers had left for Paris to serve Charles in his increasingly burdensome responsibilities. Others had been lost to illness, or to the war that simmered still between Burgundy and the Loyalists. The tapestries that once sang with the clamor of courtly games now hung in a more subdued stillness. The music was softer, the voices gentler. Isabella had taken to rising before the sun, when the halls were still cloaked in shadows and dew. She would walk slowly through the garden paths, pausing beneath the blossoming hawthorn or beside the small stone fountain. The water trickled faintly, just enough to remind her that the world had not stopped. She often wore a dark cloak now, not out of mourning but because the mornings chilled her bones more than they once had. Beneath it, she kept a rosary gifted to her in childhood, from her mother, she thought, though the exact moment had long slipped from memory. Some mornings she would stop by the chapel to kneel and recite the prayers she had known since girlhood, her fingers moving slowly over each bead, lips forming each syllable like a whisper to the past. She no longer prayed for kings or treaties. She prayed for her children. She prayed for those whose names she would never know, villagers in ruined towns, young men buried without markers, mothers who waited at windows for sons who would not return. There was no grand philosophy in her prayers, only the sincere wish that fewer people suffer in the shadows of ambition. Charles, her husband, had grown into his leadership. He traveled often now, meeting with envoys, commanding troops, tending to the burning fractures of France. When he returned, he was tired, but always kind. He would sit beside her and tell her of what he had seen, not always the battles, but the smaller things, a child rescued from a siege, a song sung in the ruins of a chapel, a merchant who rebuilt his shop after fire. Their conversations had changed. They no longer spoke of alliances or inheritance. They spoke of meaning, of the legacy they might leave, not in titles or territory, but in the way they had tried to hold fast to something good in a world always trembling. One evening, Isabella sat with her daughter Jean, now nearly 8, beneath the canopy of vines at the far end of the courtyard. The child had brought a book of illustrated saints' lives, but instead of reading, she asked her mother a question. "Mama," she said, "were you really a queen?" Isabella smiled. "Yes, once." "Did you wear a crown?" "Only for a few days." "Was it heavy?" She paused before answering. "Yes," she said. "Heavier than I expected." The girl looked thoughtful, her finger tracing the edge of the book's leather binding. "Were you happy?" Isabella did not answer right away. The wind moved gently through the ivy. "I was many things," she finally said. "Happy sometimes. Frightened often. But always trying to do what was right." Jean leaned her head against her mother's arm, and Isabella wrapped her cloak around them both. That night, Isabella wrote a letter. Not to a monarch or a bishop or a diplomat, but to her daughter. She wrote of gardens, of poetry, of the lessons she had learned, not in palaces, but in silence. She wrote that kindness would always outlast cruelty. That gentleness was not weakness, but a form of courage. That true loyalty meant loving what was broken, and still choosing to stay. She left the letter, sealed in wax, in a small chest beside her books. Isabella's health continued to decline. The physicians offered remedies, tonics of herbs and rare stones, but she knew the end was drawing near. She did not fear it. Death was no longer a stranger. It had walked beside her too long. In September of 1416, her condition worsened. The fever returned. She slept often, sometimes waking only to murmur a name from long ago, Richard, or Margaret, or a forgotten servant who once combed her hair in the Tower of London. Charles sat beside her, as he had when she nearly died after their daughter's birth. His hands were older now, but still warm. He read aloud to her from their favorite poems, his voice slow and steady. "You were always more than queen," he whispered. "You were the light in a dark time." She smiled barely. "I tried," she said, "to carry it." One morning, just before dawn, Isabella passed. The bells at Blois tolled not in great alarm, but in solemn rhythm. Not for a ruler fallen, but for a woman who had endured. She was 27 years old. a life short by years, but vast in its weight. Her funeral was held at the abbey nearby. Simple, as she had wished. She was buried beside the river, where the light filtered through poplars and the wind carried the scent of lilies in spring. In time, songs were written of her. Not grand epics, but lullabies. Gentle verses passed from mother to daughter, about the queen who had once lived among soldiers and scholars, who had learned how to read grief like scripture, and who had whispered hope into the heart of a broken century. Isabella of Valois, child bride, political prisoner, queen, duchess, mother, peacemaker, faded quietly into the history books. But for those who still read between the lines of treaties and battles, her name lingers. Softly, a footnote of light. A breath of gentleness in an age of thunder. And in the minds of those who listen closely, she remains, not as a crown, not as a symbol, but as a voice in the stillness, saying, "Endure with grace. Speak with mercy. And even in sorrow, choose love." And so, Isabella of Valois, a girl once crowned Queen of England at just 6 years old, grew into a woman who had known war, loss, betrayal, and still chose love. She lived through the fall of kings, the silence of exile, and the weight of being forgotten. But through it all, she endured. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this slow journey into the past, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you might think. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Your presence here means more than you know. Sleep well. Good night.